This is the Seema Arora podcast on sustainability, climate, business, economy, and tech. In this podcast, I conduct conversations with visionary leaders, thinkers, and change makers. This episode will focus on the complex and evolving role of regulations and deregulation in shaping economic growth, innovation, competition, and entrepreneurship. My guest will provide a unique lens, both as a policy insider and a longtime academic, and will explore lessons from his work at the DOJ, FTC, and at Vanderbilt University, while also diving into current debates on unicorns, AI, and global competitiveness. So I am absolutely thrilled to welcome this guest, Professor Luke Froeb.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have been a very dear colleague and friend for many years. And I'm so delighted to have you here with me and pick your brains on all these things.
What I've learned from teaching at Vanderbilt is that to teach well, you have to exceed the students' expectations. There's two ways you can do that. You can either deliver great content that they didn't expect, or you can lower their expectations. So I'm going to try to lower the expectations of people. I'm a bureaucrat who can't hold a job, so that's why I switch around.
Well, that's funny. Well, just I want to provide your background to the viewers, and
Okay.
many of you will know you already. You're the William Emig Professor. Did I pronounce that right?
Billy Emig. I'll give you a quick background. So
Yeah.
I went undergrad at Stanford. I wanted to be a physicist, but I wasn't smart enough, so I switched over to econ, and yeah, I was plenty smart for econ, and so I became an economist, and then I went to the University of Wisconsin where I studied econometrics, and I taught econometrics at Tulane University, and then I got a job at the Justice Department, and I was the
Okay.
data guy for about 8 or 10 years at the Department of Justice, and I got involved on a lot of cases that involved data. It was the bulk of the work was merger work, and I got interested in modeling merger effects, and then I went to the University of Chicago, got a fellowship at the University of Chicago, where I came out of the libertarian closet,
Uh-huh.
and I was a long-haired communist when I was an undergrad, lived in a commune. And then I was a labor organizer in graduate school. Then I kind of saw how government worked from the inside, and I hung around with a bunch of Harold Dempsey students, and
Yeah.
they kind of brought me out of the libertarian closet. And anyway, it was a great experience. You know, we'd sit at a bar across from the Treasury and talk about our work. You know, a bunch of libertarians working for government agencies, and it was ironic to say the least. Anyway,
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting trajectory of ideology. And
well,
many people,
it's really a common one. Churchill's the
yeah.
one who said, "If you're not a liberal in your 20s, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative in your 30s, you have no brain." And
Yeah.
so I went through that transformation.
Yeah. And, but you're still there. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll talk many topics, and I want you to be your true, authentic self. And that's what I think, even in teaching, like, remember, you would say things that were very provocative, but at the same time very insightful. And I think that's the mark of a good teacher, who elicits kind of thinking around hard issues.
People don't forget those kind of lessons, and it just makes them think,
Yeah.
which is my only goal.
Okay, so we are going to talk about the focus of today's talk. We'll keep it, and I should also say that you are a microeconomist, and as you say always, you're wrong about the little things.
Little things, yeah.
So, so we'll kind of keep that in mind as we ask you questions along the spectrum of what is happening right now. So the first topic I want to take up with you is the heavy deregulatory agenda of President. And what do you think are the kind of takeaways from what has been done and what is in the works?
Really important to recognize the good stuff that's going on, and I as I've gotten older, I've become a kind of a one issue economist, and the issue is innovation.
Hmm.
Innovation drives growth. Our growth is at, like, per capita growth is like 1.5%. And that means our income doubles every 40 years. Our kids, when they reach 40, will have twice as much income as we did on average. And so that means that all the political fights that we think are so bad right now, imagine we are fighting over a fixed pie. I mean, at least we're fighting over a growing pie.
Yeah.
And I think the fights would get a lot worse if the pie were fixed, a zero sum society in that case. But it's not, because the pie is growing. And anyway, so that's what I really focus on. And the deregulation is just an example of that. You think about the big innovations just in the last, in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
It's online retail. So Amazon, huge innovator, and so we have somebody like Jeff Bezos kind of figuring out how to sell books online and then expanding to everything. And you think about how that would work. Why did Jeff Bezos appear in the United States and not some other place? And I think it has to do with the gains from innovating. So if I have a 1 in 10 chance of making $1 million,
Yeah.
as an economist, we want, if that cost me less than $1 million, that's a positive NPV project.
Yeah.
But if you get lucky and you actually make that investment, and it returns 10 million bucks, but you don't get to keep that 10 million bucks because, hey, we don't like, inequality or whatever. You're not going to make that investment. And so I think that's just one example. And then all the regulations. Okay, so if you do hit that 1 in 10 chance, and you
Hmm.
and you in
Yeah.
Europe, for example, your rivals can complain about you, and they take those complaints seriously. And if you look at kind of innovation in the U.S. versus, and so they throttle successful companies. They penalize, and this was called the antitrust paradox. By
Yeah.
Bork. It's only the really successful companies that get targeted by the government. It's like a tax
Hmm.
on innovation.
Yeah. Well, very true. I mean, but deregulation across the spectrum, or clearly some regulations are needed,
Of
and
course, yeah.
but just because you have public goods and you need to protect them, and there is a whole spectrum of regulations, right? From very
Yeah.
market oriented to obviously very descriptive, prescriptive regulations which need to be done away with. But there is a whole spectrum of regulations. And so I think in this particular case, what do you think has been the main focus? We've heard a lot of scaling back of, like President Trump has announced that for every one new regulation that is going to be put forth, you have to get rid of 10
Yeah.
regulations already. And
And I think that that's being driven by the fact there's really no constituency that wants to get rid of regulations. People, and so it's hard to generate any kind of interest in getting. Congressmen don't get rewarded for oh yeah, I got rid of all these regulations.
yeah,
And it's because you build up these interest groups who are used to these regulations, who make their money on them.
yeah,
And there's a saying. We used to have a saying when I worked in the government: you can never convince a person of anything if their livelihood depends on not knowing it.
yeah,
And it's just very hard to get rid of these things. And so for example, you know, the fintech is a huge potential area for innovation. Why do we need banks and all these kind of financial intermediaries? Wouldn't technology be able to replace a lot of that? And the answer is yes, it would, but
yeah,
only if they're allowed to do it.
yeah,
And President Biden slapped all these regulations on fintech, and President Trump has removed a lot of those. And I talked to one of my former students who's and just truth
yeah,
and disclosure, I invest in some fintech. But one of my former students called me, and he was ecstatic. And he's not a Republican by any means,
yeah.
and but he was ecstatic about President Trump's deregulatory efforts in fintech, and he said, "Oh,
Mhm.
it's new life in our industry." So he was very excited about that.
Yeah. So these regulations, all these were pertaining to the Dodd-Frank era as well. I mean, the
Uh,
set of regulations, as well as, I mean, there's a lot of scale back even from the SEC in terms of
yeah, yeah.
requirements. Yeah,
So my kind of take is the Enron scandal. Never let a scandal go to waste. That's the kind of a
yeah,
mantra in DC,
yeah,
and you use it to pass these really onerous regulations. And so if you're a publicly traded company, all of a sudden, if you sign off on an accounting on a financial statement,
yeah,
it's wrong. I mean, you're criminally liable. You can go to jail. And so they dramatically raised the cost of accessing public markets. And so that's what led to the growth in private equity. Nobody they just made it very costly to
yeah,
to be a public company. And so that led to this radical growth in private equity.
yeah,
And fortunately, we have the capability, our economy has the capability to respond to shocks. And that's, I think, if you had to boil it down to one thing, I think that's it. Our economy is much more, I don't know, resilient, or you could even say Nicholas Taleb, the guy who wrote The Black Swan, had wrote this
yeah,
book called Anti-Fragile. And the idea is there's this taxonomy between robust things that don't break when exposed to shocks, fragile things do break when exposed to shocks, and anti-fragile things get stronger when exposed to shocks.
okay,
And if you think of a well-functioning economy, there's a shock, decline in demand for, say, leg
yeah,
warmers. To take an example from the 70s, what happens? It stopped making leg warmers, and they start making sweaters instead of leg warmers, and responds to those shocks pretty easily. But if you've got
yeah,
a lot of regulation and
yeah,
unionization, in fact, makes it much harder to respond to shocks. And we have low levels of unionization, especially in red states with right to work laws, and they make it much easier to respond to shocks. And that's what makes us strong. That's what allows us to grow, and that's what makes us wealthy. That's
yeah,
the part of the growth that I talked about, alluded to earlier.
yeah. I mean, definitely, but I think a lot of people are increasingly feeling the inequality.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah. That
that's kind
a byproduct of that is
yeah,
is in think about incentive pay. If you have incentive pay, you're going to end up paying the best, most productive people, or the hardest workers. You're going to end up paying them more, and
yeah,
it's going to generate inequality. And can you tolerate that? If you can't tolerate that inequality, you say, okay, no incentive pay, and that kills innovation.
yeah,
That kills incentive alignment. How do I align the incentives of my employees with the goals of the organization? I mean, one of the I remember one story, and I have to check this out, but the 2 and 20, typical, you know you know uh, incentive pay for hey, you get 2%, 2% of the equity, and then 20% of the profits. Those kinds of incentive payment schemes just don't exist in other areas where there's the real hostility to inequality. And paying your employees with stock options, and then if they turn out, you get a lot of money. They're just not used in other areas. and
yeah,
uh, and and I'm not. This is not my area of expertise, but part of it is the inequality that they generate.
yeah,
And is it our tolerance for inequality that makes us rich? Well, you can certainly tell a theoretical story. I'm sure that, and there's certainly anecdotes about that, but there's a
yeah,
reason that a lot of startups are started by immigrants from foreign countries. They can't get the return.
mhm,
If they're taking a 1 in 10 chance of earning a 10 million bucks, and they can't get if everything works out well, they can't get the payoff. They're going to come to the United States where they can. And so a lot of successful startups are started by immigrants from other countries, and that is a huge brain drain, that we benefit from in the United
yeah,
States. I mean, to an economist, trade moves assets to higher valued uses. And trade and labor is just one other aspect of that. having if Milton Friedman kind of, you know, identified this problem a long time ago. All economists are for trade. Voluntary transactions create wealth by moving assets to higher valued uses, and labor is one of our most valuable assets.
Yeah.
But if you have a very generous welfare system, then you get, people immigrating not for jobs, which is great, but immigrating for 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 the generous welfare benefits, which is not so great. So
Mhm.
anyway, that's a distinction that I you know that I think should be made. But again, this I'm speaking out of my area. I have lots of strong, unslanted opinions, but
Yeah. Um, True. So, okay, so going back to the deregulatory agenda,
yeah.
uh, with your experience, so tell me a little bit about your time at the FTC and the
Oh, it was
DOJ.
it was
Sort of,
it was
uh,
it was so much
yeah,
fun.
yeah,
I was a staff economist at the Department of Justice,
yeah,
and then I went to Vanderbilt, and I came back to as chief economist of the FTC under Bush the Junior, and then went back to Vanderbilt, and then came back as chief economist of the Justice Department of the Antitrust Division under President Trump during his first term, and it
yeah,
was lots of fun to do that. It was really fascinating. And When we were at the FTC, they had a very aggressive competition advocacy. And
okay,
basically we'd identify a lot of the big problems were not being caused in the private sector.
yeah,
Our mandate is to regulate mergers and monopolization and price fixing,
hmm,
but a lot of it was being caused by dumb government regulations and like barriers to entry in various industries, and getting rid of those barriers to entry. We would write a lot of reports on occupational licensure. I mean, it was unbelievable. So hair braiding was regulated. You had to go to cosmetology school for, I don't know, however long it takes to go to cosmetology school, and we would be invited by state legislators who said, "Look, this is really stupid regulation." And so the FTC staff would, or the economists would do a study of it and said, "Yeah, this is likely effect," and we'd send it out, and half the time it would help get rid of the regulation or modify it so that it wasn't so onerous,
yeah,
and or narrowly focus it, because as you well know, that regulatory capture is a big problem. Once you put these regulations in place, you create a constituency who benefits from them, and it becomes very, very hard to change that.
yeah. So this was at the DOJ, the
No, that
antitrust.
was at the FTC. At the DOJ, we had the same. It wasn't as active as a focus as it was at the FTC when I was there. At the DOJ, it was we still had it, and we still would weigh in on dumb regulations with other agencies. During the first term, we brought the first. Yeah, this was we brought the first vertical litigated merger case in over 40 years. AT&T Time Warner.
Okay.
And so it was a vertical merger, complementary products. To tell a complementary product story, it's pretty complicated, because you're using the same logic with horizontal mergers. Two substitutes. If two substitutes stop competing with each other, you know, now I'm not concerned about losing sales to you. So there's an upside to raising my price. And with
Yeah.
complementary products, the very same logic goes through, but it's with lowering price. So now if I lower my price, you pick up extra sales, because they're complementary products. If people buy mine, they also buy yours. And so there's a natural incentive to lower price. To overcome that simple story, you've got to tell a more complicated story, that hey, now if I some kind of foreclosure story, where if I cut off, if I raise the price to you, that's going to make you a less effective downstream competitor to me, there do exist theoretical models that make that a valid story, but it's a really hard story to tell. And I remember we go into court and we tried to tell that story, and every piece of evidence, just all it, so now they're going to raise price to the rival downstream competitors, and then people would shift over to AT&T, and that would allow us to recoup the loss that we made from not selling to those rivals. Kind of each element of that story, is another kind of chain that you have to make all those things come true, and we couldn't prove them, and in retrospect it was a really valuable experience because everybody realized, oh my gosh, you got to prove all this stuff to bring a vertical merger case. And yeah, it was really eye-opening to see how difficult
Yeah.
it was to do that in court. As I said, it was the first litigated vertical case in 40 years, and that was really, really interesting.
So you had to simulate every time what would be the impact.
No, no,
Uh,
not just simulate, but actually prove it. So,
Prove it.
so,
So
so, the models that, what economists do is they're really good at figuring out what the counterfactuals are. So
yeah,
why do you need counterfactuals? Well, you've got to know what would have happened if they hadn't raised rivals' cost.
yeah,
And there's two ways to do that. One is empirically, just, hey, let's find somebody who's done that and see what happened. And the other way is to, okay, let's build a model, try to fit it to what we can observe, and then use it to forecast that which we can't. The models
yeah,
that we used, has all those causal links in it, and you got to match those up with with real evidence. And the expert witness gets on the stand, and the judge says, well, show me this, show me this, show me this. Every broke down the story into each causal link and show me the evidence, and we couldn't show the evidence on a couple of the causal links, so he didn't believe the model.
yeah.
And that I think that's really valuable. And so really valuable experience,
So
both as deterrents. So okay, so now we know what's going to happen if we go to court. These vertical mergers, they're looking ahead, reasoning back, and saying, okay, do we want to go through the long cost of a court trial, or just accept some kind of settlement that might do the same thing? Again, there's some evidence on these divestitures and settlements that that have happened. Anyway, we'll
yeah,
see.
yeah. Well, so I read somewhere you had this saying, if mergers are the answer, what is the question?
Oh yeah.
Uh, so what was that in relation to?
Well, it was
Any
so funny. We
Yeah,
it it was, I can't divulge any details that, but we're getting, if you have a big enough merger, I forget, it was like 60 or $70 million now, you
yeah,
have to file with both the FTC and the Department of Justice. And as part of that, you fill out this pre-merger form, and you have to send reports, studies that kind of talk about the impact of the merger.
yeah,
And most of them were written by, what I call is, at least when they got on the stand, it was I called it, well, they were written by junior economists. The people knew why they wanted to merge. The CEOs knew why they wanted to merge, but they'd go to the the probably the most junior person at the company, say, hey, write a memo justifying this merger. And
yeah.
the junior person would go and look up his corporate strategy textbook. Here's all the reasons for merging. He'd just copy them out of the textbook. And one of those reasons for merging was eliminate competition. And
Oh,
that was the smoking gun that, we would go into court and say, this is a smoking gun. This merger is going to eliminate competition. And they would counter with what we call the brain damaged middle management defense, that they were just copying this thing out of the corporate strategy textbook. This is not going to eliminate and then we'd have to go to the next step. But anyway, the attorneys get very excited about smoking guns.
yeah,
Economists less so. We want evidence and want to show stuff.
yeah. The present day equivalent of that would be going to Chat GPT and getting that kind of question, right?
Oh no, no. ChatGPT is much, in my
Then
experience,
you
using
define.
is much better than that. They wouldn't do that. I mean, they would. It's ChatGPT is really unbelievable. I think it's gonna radically change at least what I do.
Yeah,
It's such a valuable tool, and it can do a lot. And it's like having a really sharp undergrad, research assistant who can easily search, search public records, summarize them, and I think it's really interesting, and it just jumpstarts a lot of work that people can do, and kind of learning how to use it effectively. I think is going to be really important for our profession.
yeah. I mean, talking about ChatGPT, there is this, they had a very symbiotic relationship between Microsoft and OpenAI. And I think Microsoft made some initial investment. When it makes that, so, I mean, the context is that OpenAI is now, because it's converting to a public benefit corporation, it wants, Microsoft out on some intellectual property because of an acquisition that they made. So,
And they've
my
threatened
question,
antitrust. Yeah.
my question in the context of the antitrust is, one, when they make these investments, which are now being again examined by some of the officials, I think, is initially they made the investment and it was so easy for Microsoft to acquire that stake without any kind of review by anyone other than the two parties. And now OpenAI is threatening Microsoft with like a complaint to the antitrust. So what is this kind of interesting, we want regulations but we don't want it on ourselves kind of play going on in the unicorn world? I think, what is your view on this kind of
Well, I first of all, what I do know is that a lot of contractual disputes, the alternatives to an agreement determine the terms of an agreement. So Microsoft is bargaining with OpenAI, or say OpenAI is bargaining with Microsoft to try to get
right?
out of it, and they're threatening, and they're saying, well, if you don't get out of it, here's the alternative, and they're trying to use the threat of antitrust to capture a bigger share of the proverbial pie. And Microsoft is pushing back, and I would, and so all I know is that in my experience, there's a lot of private contractual disputes that
Yeah,
masquerade as antitrust. It's just a contractual dispute, and antitrust is coming into it because, okay, we have these antitrust laws in it, and we can use them to change the alternatives. And if I can change the alternatives to reaching agreement with you, then and if there's a chance that we'll be able to get away from you without having to pay you, or
yeah.
and I don't know the details of this thing,
Hmm.
but that's how I view it. It's a contract dispute, and they're bringing antitrust into it to try to get a bigger share of the proverbial pie. Now, whether or not that's going to be successful, I don't really know. We saw a lot of these disputes when I was at the DOJ between franchisors and franchisees, and so
Hmm.
you sign a, I'm a I'm a parent company and you're a franchisee.
Yeah,
So you're a, I don't know, and you're a gas station on a turnpike, and
yeah,
or no, you're a McDonald's. Is okay? Here's a good. Is you're a McDonald's on a turnpike, and McDonald's owns all its own franchisees that, or most of its franchisees that, and I could be wrong about it, this could have changed, and this is 20 years ago,
yeah,
owns most of its franchisees on the on the turnpike, on the freeways,
yeah,
but in towns they don't. You think about, well, why would that be? And so the conflict between franchisors and franchisees is over brand quality. So the franchisor wants the franchisee to invest in brand quality, keep the brand, keep the brand strong, make the food really good, clean the bathrooms every day. So
yeah,
they want all those things done,
yeah,
and and if you're in a town and you get a reputation for having, you're the local McDonald's franchisee and you don't clean your bathroom, nobody's
Mhm.
going to come to your store anymore. They go, let's not go to that store. So they don't have to. So if you're in a local town with repeat business, you have a
Yeah,
reputation to maintain, and you're gonna do that without, as a franchisee. But on a freeway where people are just passing through once every year, once every other year, there's no real incentive to, you don't have that local reputation. And so McDonald's goes, okay, it's too hard to control that franchisee behavior. So in areas, so we're going to own our own franchisees that are on the freeway, or yeah, own our own stores that are on the freeway. So
yeah,
anyway, that's
yeah,
that's just an example of that conflict.
yeah. So, I mean, just kind of going a little deeper here, do you have to find uh, an analogy to kind of present the case that this is what happened in the year Standard Oil versus some um, and is that something you can draw from and prove your case, or is it just a an economic analysis without references to the past
Well,
legal?
the attorneys always, they have to follow the case law, and
Yeah,
those decisions, to the extent that they're relevant, they follow
yeah,
that case law, and but the economists are,
that's doing
we have a
yeah,
very specific job. Let's
yeah, yeah,
let's 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 analyze the economics of it. And that means, how do I prove causality, and
yeah,
which is liability or damages, if once we prove liability. And it's interesting. One of the critiques of the Biden administration's antitrust focus was that there's been this 50 years of basically bipartisan antitrust jurisprudence, and we've kind of reached all these, ever since the Reagan administration, we've reached all these, it's like, okay, you got to prove this, you got to prove that. If there's a critique to the President Reagan put economists in charge of the agencies, and at that point, it became an economic analysis, and
yeah,
that economic analysis has held pretty much steady. It shifts left and right a little bit, according
yeah,
to the president, uh, but not too much. There's still this
yeah,
big center. But President Biden appointees really kind of said, "Hey, we're going to get away from that because it makes cases too hard to choose, too hard to prove, and or too hard to win." And so we're going to go back to this jurisprudence where we're going to ignore the last 50 years of case law, and
yeah,
we're going to go back to big is bad, structural presumptions. We're going to use unfair methods of competition. Talk about an untethered law. Unfair methods of competition was taken, at least, in my experience, to mean anti-competitive. It's harming somebody, and particularly it's harming consumers. And
hmm,
so there was no disconnect between, the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act, but the Biden administration, kind of went back to this 50 years of jurisprudence and said, hey, this is unfair. And so they've expanded, and it really was, their merger guidelines really was a move away from this kind of rational economic based approach, and ostensibly because it made cases easier to bring. And
yeah,
they opened up they opened up cases against the most successful firms in the country. I mean, talking about penalizing innovation. I mean, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, the big guys all
yeah,
were put under antitrust scrutiny. Anyway, and I didn't work on a lot of those cases, but so I don't know the details of them,
yeah,
but but anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out,
yeah,
and it could easily play out the wrong way, uh, and I think that would really be bad for innovation, So
yeah.
hey,
Is this like the Brandeis framework in terms of
well, Brandeis it was hard to, so I have a colleague who wrote a book about the origins of antitrust, and And I find it hard to pin down the Brandeis. It's kind of like we know it when we see it, but don't ask us to prove it. That's kind of a very pejorative characterization of it. I'm sure they would have a much more articulate, because I'm obviously not in favor of that. But
Yeah.
it's more of that's more of the legal side outside
Yeah.
my my area of expertise. But it's like the whole idea that big was bad. That went down big time when I was at the Justice Department. I was there at the tail end of the Reagan. And I remember, just kind of showing, building, it's not very hard to build models showing that, that mergers between big firms are actually good. Big firms are big because for a reason they have lower cost, better product or something. And big being bad is not. You got to figure out why they're bad, and you can't just look at, oh, there's a big firm, they must be doing something bad, or they're making money, they must be. And that's the going back to the zero sum fallacy. They're making money, so they must be taking it from somebody, and
Yeah.
rather than creating wealth, they anyway. It's just that, the other side of the political spectrum, where these kind of beliefs are,
Yeah.
it's just a difference in focus or in
So,
belief.
while at the Justice, you developed the competitor tools.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So it was fun. We developed these sets of tools that, they're basically game theory. We're going to model how firms compete and use these tools to model the loss of competition following merger or price fixing or monopolization. And you can use these tools. And when I was at the Department of Justice, they were based on some work I did with a couple of colleagues. Actually, we got hired by the Department of Justice to write software for the DOJ, and we wrote all this Mathematica code to characterize competition and simulate the loss of competition following merger, mostly. And a couple colleague at Vanderbilt, Stephen Shantz, and a colleague at Justice, Greg Worden, and it was really fun. And when I went back to the DOJ under President Trump, there was one economist there who was very excited about that, and he put them all up in. I think he wrote them in R. Kind of translated a lot
oh,
of the models in R, and used, and made them richer, and added some of his own twists. But that was a big effort of mine to put those up online so that people appearing before the justice, hey, this is how we're going to evaluate the mergers. If you want to make an argument, I would say either come in and say why this model doesn't hold, or show that that we're using the wrong parameters to drive the model. It makes the arguments much more transparent and
yeah.
falsifiable. If they're
Okay.
falsifiable, they become credible. Now,
Yeah.
if you come in with an argument that's not falsifiable, like, oh yeah, big is bad, and I know anti-competitive behavior when I see it, that's not
Yeah.
falsifiable. That's not scientific. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely. So, is this available online? I
yeah,
know
yeah.
I would love to use that.
Competitiontoolbox.com.
Uh,
Competitiontoolbox.com. Yeah,
okay.
and if you want some code, yeah, just email me.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I've invested a lot of time in learning R, and
Yeah.
so I use that
I
very
do, I do
frequently.
not. I program in Mathematica. I don't like.
Yeah.
I don't use R.
Well, I just use it because of open source, and I didn't want to
Yeah.
spend any money.
Yeah. No, I
to,
totally hear you. And the R code's there on the.
yeah.
You can just grab all the R code if you want.
Okay, perfect. Because I think it really helps when you see the models, and then you can figure out, as you said, it has to be falsifiable. I mean, it's not enough to say that well, it looks anti-competitive,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean,
But
that's
actual
what it was like.
economists, yeah,
That
yeah,
was that's what it was like before President Reagan kind of put the economists in charge of the agencies, and
yeah,
that was a huge sea change. And the lawyers hated, the attorneys hated it,
yeah,
and the economists loved it. And so there was
yeah, yeah.
there was a lot of clashes in the early days of the Reagan administration.
Yeah, I mean, and even in the environmental regulations, there was a time when regulations were just being imposed, but then came a time when cost benefit analysis became important in imposing any
my
regulations.
my
And
my roommate, when I was a junior economist at the Justice Department, my roommate worked at the EPA, and we'd come home
oh,
and trade stories about out the attorneys versus the economists, and the idea that there would, and the thing that really really amazed him is that there was an optimal that amazed the attorneys, that nobody could accept the fact that there was an optimal level of pollution.
yeah,
I mean, they said all pollution is bad. Let's get rid of it. And obviously, well, you want to kill yourself? Well, that would reduce all the pollution that you generate, all the CO2 that you breathe. Anyways,
yeah,
it was so amazing. I mean, I had a hard time with the attorneys at the Department of Justice. My roommate just had it was a quantum leap
yeah.
above. I mean, he had such a much harder time at
Yeah. Well, I have to say that I also collaborated with the EPA, but we worked on this idea of voluntary regulations, which were very market friendly. They, reduced costs for businesses and also cleaned up the environment. And that was based on things like public recognition impacts. And sometimes they were just, over the long run, they were much better to implement. But I totally get it, where you're coming from and the idea of
I have a question. I
regulations.
have a question. I have a question for you. So
Sure.
all these, and this is just my curiosity. So all these
Okay.
ESG funds, that invest in
Yeah.
environmentally friendly industries, that take care of E, S,
Yeah.
or G, and
Yeah.
I'm thinking, as an economist, if the markets are efficient, and it's
Hmm.
profitable to do, it'll
Yeah.
get done. But if the
Yeah.
markets but and so the only time you would want to do that is when it's good for the environment but it's unprofitable. And so if I invest in these funds, I have to accept, that if they're doing something they wouldn't normally do, why they
Yeah.
exist. But if they're doing something that's unprofitable, why isn't there a negative premium that you accept when you invest in an ESG fund?
Okay. So here, okay. So I'll take a little bit of time to go over
Okay.
some of this. Just, you can have, there is a spectrum of ESG funds. You can have
Okay.
values based investing, right? Where you're investing only based on your values. But a lot of the ESG funds are also value driven. So, take the case of environment. Environment also is something associated with innovations, right? So if you invest in something and it pays off, like, you can think of unicorns that are environmentally based, like batteries. You can have hydrogen as a source of fuel. So there are a lot of companies that are dedicated to cleaning up the environment and also making an impact on their bottom line. Now, this can be over the short run, over the long run. You can have, some companies that are benefiting from reducing their carbon impact, but also making reductions in their, uh, the costs associated with it, like all these participation in these voluntary programs, like the Energy Star program, for example, not only saved costs, but also reduced emissions. Similarly, a program that I worked on, it was called the 3350 program. And the whole idea there was, it was a public disclosure program. So companies were asked to reduce their highly toxic chemicals in because these were prioritized as very toxic. But what companies discovered was that when they substituted these chemicals, they often did it by using water based solvents or some other chemicals, which resulted in a lot of innovation, but also reduced the cost of conducting these kind of substitutions. And so it was quite surprising, really, when company officials themselves said, well, actually it saved us money as well. So there are a lot of these, and I would say, I mean, a lot of my work, has been on ESG, is that a lot of the environmental impacts. So consider a company like Google, right? Which you think is, oh my God, Google is also making these investments in energy efficiency. Guess what? If their data centers are energy efficient, they actually gain a huge amount of savings cost reduction, and also they get the bragging points that we are environmentally conscious. But behind every single decision of a company like Google, which is known as more progressive, there is a bottom line that actually validates it. I don't think any company, and this is serious, the ESG part, in the environmental part, you can easily claim that any company that does it is either a pure play, like for example, if I say, sustainable clothing, look, right, which is a big fashion thing right now. Millennials love it, Gen Z loves it. They don't want to have clothes which are going down in dumpsters. Think of plastic, think of everything. They can charge a slightly higher premium for their products legitimately, and consumers are willing to pay for that green premium, and so companies are actually benefiting from it. It's a simple, think of it as a product differentiation argument.
No, I get
So there
that. I
are,
get
yeah,
I get
so
that. No, I get that.
so
Those are market based. I mean,
yeah,
those investments would be undertaken regardless of the ESG fund.
regardless. So
Yeah,
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 so
yeah.
why have a law saying, oh, there should not be this ESG, kind of, for I
So
don't think it should be like, yeah. I mean, in the social aspect, you can say, well, companies benefit from having diversity of viewpoints and so on. And there are some studies which show that the impact on the bottom line is also good, right? Imagine a company like, again, a big company like Amazon, which is not diverse. I mean, how you are in like 150 countries, you cannot have like a viewpoint of, no, we are not going to be. So it's just like basic business sense. And if you
okay.
talk about governance, I mean, who would want to invest in a company that has insider trading and CEO, conflicts of interest and compensation issues? So I think ESG is actually pretty basic. In fact, it's a good, what is it called? How do you sieve, right? It's a good way of saying, okay, this might be a good company. But obviously, I mean, there's abuse, right? You can say you can have really bad environmental
Well, I get
investments.
it. I get what you're saying. That
Yeah,
I totally get it. I was just
yeah,
asking a very narrow question, and it's why
yeah,
isn't there a penalty for investing in ESG funds? If and you answered that quite well. So thank you.
yeah, yeah.
I have one more question. One more question. One of the things that President Trump is doing, he's making nuclear power much easier to do.
Yes,
President Biden had
yeah,
a ton of regulations. The only green, from my, this is your area, but it seems like the only green energy is going to get us to, zero carbon emissions or, get us closer to that. And he's deregulated that. And I just view that as really, really positive.
yeah.
How's that viewed in the ESG community?
So, I had this very nice conversation with Mr. William Riley. Mr. William Riley, he was the head of he was the EPA administrator under the senior President Bush.
Okay.
And
So
I,
I was there when he was there, so I didn't know who he
oh, were
was.
you there? Okay. So I was
Well,
also
I
in
was under
Washington.
Bush the Junior. Sorry, I was under Bush the Junior. Go ahead, keep going.
Okay. So I was in DC at the time, and I was working on my PhD and, on voluntary programs. And he was the administrator who initiated all these voluntary programs and market based regulations. And he used to consult industry because a lot of times EPA was regulating like chemicals that did not even exist in their companies were not even producing, and they were on the list of regulated chemicals. So this was a huge initiative of his on voluntary programs, right? The point was that, so I had this long podcast interview with him, and he has said that nuclear is, the of course, the cleanest source of energy. And I think even at that time, he was on board with it. There was, of course, and there is still a lot of regulatory need for exposure to radiation, but it has, that discussion has not come into play as much as one would have thought. Because while in France it has been always the case that they rely on nuclear energy through like small reactors, in the US it was perceived after the 3 Mile Island accident that it would not be welcome. But somehow, no, activists have come forth as much as you would think. Uh, and also, because of these demands for AI, the electricity demands, nuclear has been the option. So you see all these AI. So, for example, this
So bottom
open
line,
AI.
you're in favor of President Trump's deregulatory efforts in nuclear.
Yeah,
Is that
because I think there's no the power. There's not. There's going to be a huge surge in demand, and that seems to be like fairly safe, given the experience of France.
uh-huh.
Uh, there have been not many accidents, and but definitely it requires regulation and um, watchful eye. But just to
But
tell
not
you
to the
that,
extent that President Biden was doing it, who just basically, the
yeah, I
shut it
think
down.
that transition has happened already. And from my talks with Mr. Riley, I think, he thought it was a good move to,
Okay. Well,
and I
good.
don't want to misquote him, but that's the sense I got. And all these companies, which are AI companies, for example, Sam Altman of OpenAI is investing in Oklo. So there are these startups, and just recently Bill Gates has been investing in now nuclear source of energy. That's like the with AI, that's a hot button kind of investment to go after.
Okay.
um, yeah,
Yeah.
so it's
Well, it sounds. Uh,
that's definitely a kind of a departure from the previous administration, which was focusing more on the renewable side as sources of electricity generation. But now, so what else can we talk about? Oh, so the other thing that I just wanted to touch kind of on, just go back to your, again, the FTC. And again, I mean, as general as you can get, because
yeah.
we're not really going into particular cases, but definitely there was this case brought about on Meta for its acquisition. So now so it's so we're in 2025,
Yeah.
and this suit is brought about to question, what happened in 2012, 2014. Why doesn't the FTC wake up? It's just because it waits for the company to become successful, or is more the agenda that was in the
No, I
uh,
mean, again, it's the counterfactual.
yeah,
What would have happened had
yeah,
they blocked the acquisition? What would have happened if they let it go through? Well, they let it go through. We know what happened.
yeah,
They got
but
big. It got very successful. And the
yeah,
counterfactual. Well, what if they had never bought it? Would they have
yeah,
gotten six? And I think I've been pushing very hard. So when you do cost benefit analysis, you consider all the costs and benefits that vary with the consequence of the decision. If you miss
yeah,
some, that's the hidden cost fallacy. But you
mhm,
consider only costs and benefits that vary with the consequence of the decision. If you take account of irrelevant ones, that's the sunk cost fallacy.
yeah,
And I think, that by blocking by focusing on, oh yeah, there's potential competition down the road. Well, that's pretty speculative.
yeah,
Okay, so they might have become competitors in some future state of the world if we had blocked this acquisition and they'd grown on their own. And
yeah,
what I think that miss, first of all, that's speculative, so we don't know. But I think what that misses is if you don't have exits by incumbents. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of startups, their business plan, they present it to the investors. Hey, if we're successful, we'll get
we will,
purchased by Google,
yeah,
Amazon, Facebook, Apple, or
yeah,
Microsoft. That's their business
yeah,
plan.
yeah,
And if
yeah,
you take away those exits, you get rid of the entrants. The people would have never started up.
you're right,
And that's I think that I think that is really, really important. I just see it in my students who are involved in the startup area. I see that is that the exits are so important.
yeah,
And I just think that the antitrust authorities, don't really, they'll consider this kind of potential future competition, but they don't consider that, okay, if they block they block the exits, they'll block the entrance. I'm not going
Yeah,
to enter if I can't exit. So
yeah,
so
yeah,
anyway, so that's just I think a hidden cost of challenging those acquisitions.
yeah. So acquisition definitely is a business model for many, many startups.
Yeah.
That's what they aspire to rather than. And I mean, and while they have all these cases on them, they continue to make more investments with bigger stakes. And for example, their acquisition of Scale AI and uh, Meta's acquisition of Scale AI or investment in Scale AI has proceeded. So also the lag, yeah, is kind of interesting in when they're under scrutiny. Okay, so now I want you to, okay, so we've talked a lot about different kinds of regulations, and I want to um, say that, as a professor of economics, and what are the three things? So, like, tell me the story about your grandson and how what are the three things? Well, you look very young, first of all. So, but I know you have a grandson.
I'm a
Uh,
grandpa.
what are the three things you want him to know about economics?
I would love to have him, as a toolbox. I would love to have him, grow up knowing that, hey, it's a way of, I don't know anything about this situation. What would happen if everybody acted in their own self-interest? And I want to use that as a toolbox. Not that people do, it's not a prescription, it's not how you should act. It's
Mhm.
just to say, okay, it's a toolbox that I can pull a tool out and I can analyze, well, what's going to happen in this situation. I would love it if he'd appreciate that. I would love to get him to understand the principles of wealth creation. How is wealth created? How is it, and how do I capture some of that? So when if I have a friend who's devoted a lot of her time to you know redoing, investing a lot of her time without kind of thinking about, hey, how am I going to exit out of here? So I said, well, okay, suppose this thing's really successful, and she's doing it with some other people. And I said, how are you guys going to split up the gains from trade,
Yeah,
and do the gains from trade go to you? And just having that perspective, like, oh yeah, here's how we're creating wealth, and okay, and here's how I'm going to capture it. And just to have that kind of idea, to look ahead, reason back, and try to figure out what the world is going to look like if everybody's acting in their own self-interest. So I guess having that, having those two. I guess the other thing that I would that I have a mug that has a bunch of sayings on the mug, and it's and I give it out on the first day of class, and I said, this is everything you need to know about the class, and I run an open mug final. So on it is voluntary transactions create wealth. But one of my favorites is that, and look ahead, reason back. That's a big one. But my other favorite one that I've found really helpful in my life is that the alternatives to an agreement determine the terms of an agreement. And so when we see OpenAI and Microsoft kind of
yeah,
fighting, and they're using antitrust to gain bargaining leverage. That general principle. What's the best time to ask for a raise? Well, when you have a good outside offer, when your
yeah,
outside offer is really,
yeah.
your alternative is really good, you can capture
Hmm.
and so you can spend time kind of improving your own outside alternatives. I always tell this to my kids. Always network, always kind of look for alternatives, because even if you stay in your current job, it's
Yeah.
going to give you bargaining leverage. You'll be able to capture a bigger share of the gains from trade. And my mom always told me this. She would phrase it. She didn't use the word network, but she just go out and call some people. Just call some people, and it always bugged me when she said it. But looking back on that, I go, oh yeah, that was really good advice. And the jargon for it now, oh, just network. I could see my mom saying that to me now. And of course, we all got into academics because we wanted to be known for what we know, not whom we know. So it's just, academics are natural by, by natural adverse selection, I would say,
Yeah.
not the greatest networkers.
Yeah. So, do you remember I used to sometimes do stand up.
Yeah, yeah.
And there was this one where it was based on Owen's students, and it was Jerry Seinfeld was appointed the new assistant professor of economics. Okay, so in the script that I wrote, Kramer walks in. I would do that imitation, but obviously I won't. So
Uh-huh.
Kramer walks in with a pint of Ben and Jerry ice cream, and he shows it to Jerry and says, "Hey Jerry, look at this Ben and Jerry ice cream. They're using your name and making a million and making a million." And he says, "Well, I don't want to make a million. I choose not to make money. That's why I became a professor." Academics choosing a certain way of living, right? And that has changed, but the idea of what, based on what you know rather than who you know is very true of an economist or, a professor. And we would have this series of multiple choice questions. And so the script went on to say, I have these students who only want to know the answers, never mind the questions. Is it true, is it false? Is it yes or is it no, right? It was just getting to the answers, as typically students at that age would do. And now with chat gpt, I hear this has become a huge issue, and I'm sure you experience that as well towards the
Yeah.
tail end of your
So
teaching.
you have to go back to in class yeah, any take home assignment. You can, and I, if you say don't use ChatGPT,
It's
I think you're hamstringing the students, because ChatGPT is a great tool. And
yeah.
every assignment that I gave them, I said use ChatGPT,
Mhm.
and I basically, it was early. It was an early version of ChatGPT. It wasn't that great, but it could get like easy 90% on my quizzes.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
since then, they people have kind of gotten more sophisticated about tricking ChatGPT, and I've heard that a lot of people are going back to Blue Book, and essays. People you have to
Yeah. Yeah.
demonstrate your knowledge about
Yeah.
using essays and not multiple choice. But anyway, yeah, I think it's just going to evolve, and I'm very excited about the possibility of it. It's a great tool, and I think if you graduate from school and you don't know how to use it,
Yeah.
you're really hamstringing yourself.
Yeah. Just to keep up with all this would really pay off for people who are
Yeah.
investing that time. Well, so it's been so great to have you.
Well,
And
thank you very much. It was delightful.
yeah, I enjoyed talking to you a lot.